I wonder this morning how you are going with contentment. Because by and large, most people these days don't seem to be going too well. Contentment in your job, if you're a worker. You satisfied? Or you want more? I heard a report the other day that said most workers surprisingly gain job satisfaction even when they hear that a colleague has had a pay rise, because it shows that at least there's hope one day for them. One day you might get a pay rise as well. Now, how about you? How's your job satisfaction? Always looking to move up a rung? Always looking, always hoping for more? What about at home? How's your contentment? Are you living on your own, maybe, wishing it was otherwise? The 2011 census says that if you're living on your own, that puts you with 1/3 of the people in our 4053 postcode. 12,000 singles never married. Now, if that's you, are you content with that? It can be painful, isn't it? Particularly in younger years, and not the life you imagined. Or you're married. How's your contentment going? In all the dreams that you once dreamed, you dreamed perhaps there'd be something more in your marriage as well. Maybe you're not satisfied. How about if you're married, how are things going in the bedroom? I've got to be bold enough to go there because our passage does in 1 Corinthians 7. Dreaming of something more. I mentioned in passing last week the book 50 Shades of Grey. It's overtaken Harry Potter as the best-selling book in all time online. And they were talking about it on TV through the week because the girls in the Olympic swim team were all reading it to help them wind down after races. Now, it is a very racy book. They say it's erotic fiction for women. And they reckon the reason it's a huge bestseller is that so many women are dissatisfied in their marriages. Which also, I guess, is one of the reasons so many marriages dissolve. That they're just not living up to expectations. Now, 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is an interesting grab bag of answers from the Apostle Paul to questions that the Corinthians have already raised in a letter to him, which you can see from the opening verse. He says to them, now for the matters you wrote about. The problem being for us, we don't actually have a copy of their original email to Paul. You can't just scroll down and see what they wrote underneath. We've only got his answers to what, if you try to work it out backwards, seems like a very odd bunch of questions. Now for the matters you wrote about. And first up, it seems like they're asking about sex within marriage. Because some seem to be saying, if you look at the literal wording, it's best not even to touch each other. Then they've got questions about whether it's better to not get married in the first place. Questions about whether to stay married if you're married. Questions about slavery and freedom, which I guess for us is like thinking about our work. And at every point in these issues that cut so close to the heart of our own sources of satisfaction and disappointment, anxiety and concern, Paul is going to give the same answer over and over again. Did you notice it? The answer is be satisfied. Stay as you are. Here it is on the screen, just a glimpse of how many times he says the same thing. Verse 8, verse 11, verse 20, verse 24 and verse 40. To every question the answer is the same. The best thing is remain. Stay as you are. Now if you have a look at verse 20, sums it up, I think, most clearly of all, where he says this: each person should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. Don't get itchy feet, you Corinthians. Same words again in verse 24. Each person, as responsible to God, should remain in the situation they were in when they were called to faith. Time after time in the original Greek, it's the same word meno, 5 times in a row. Remain, 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 remain. No matter what the question they're putting to him, the answer's always the same. Which means, it seems to me, that these Corinthians were particularly unsettled. Or else they were much like us. So much of our lives is spent dissatisfied and chasing after the kind of contentment that always just lies at the other end of the rainbow. I wonder what it would be like to be happy to just stick with it when you're edgy and restless and feeling like a change. When you're thinking life maybe owes you something more than the job you're in, than the marriage you're in, that you would be more happy or even more spiritual otherwise. Now, I want to look at it this morning under two headings, a little bit corny: cross-shaped contentment in the boardroom and cross-shaped contentment in the bedroom. Just to frustrate you, I'm going to do the boardroom first, which is a corny title just for alliteration. Not many slaves worked in the boardroom after all. But it is simply to ask the question, what's it going to look like to be content in your workplace? Whether it is the boardroom or the boiler room or the classroom or the kitchen, or in the situation Paul's talking to, in your slavery. Now, slavery doesn't translate exactly to the workplace, although on most Monday mornings you might think so. Slavery was your whole life and your whole being, and typically you didn't get to choose it. But it takes us right to the heart of chapter 7 if we start in verse 21 and look at the principles there. Because I imagine if you were a slave, your one dream for your life would have to be, wouldn't it, to one day be free. That your one ambition, the thing you wouldn't dare hope for, the thing your mum and dad, they would have always dreamed for you, it wasn't the Olympic gold medal. It was that you would one day perhaps be able to scrape together enough money to buy your own freedom. And you would stand there before the Roman magistrate and be declared a freed man and a citizen of the Roman Empire. Do you know what Paul says? He says, don't sweat the small stuff like that. If you belong to Jesus and you're a slave, you've been set free already. On the scale that really counts, you have been bought and paid for by the cross. You see how it works? When Jesus died for you, when Jesus took up your debts to God and paid them in full, he bought you and he paid for you. You're free. Which of course turns everything else upside down. Were you a slave when you were called? Verse 21. Don't let it trouble you. Although if you can gain your freedom, do so. Do it if you can, but you see it's not the defining issue. It's not the centre. Keep reading, 22. For the one who was a slave when he was called to faith in the Lord is the Lord's freed person. Similarly, the one who was free when called is Christ's slave. Now chew on that for a turnaround. So you were bought at a price, verse 23. So don't become slaves of human beings. Brothers and sisters, each person as responsible to God should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. Now you see, you'll notice he's not saying you can't take a promotion at work. He's not saying you can't take your freedom when it's offered. In fact, you probably should. But the point is, whatever you do, the freer you are to serve Jesus, the better. Because you've been bought by him at a great price, which sets you free if you're a captive, makes you his slave if you're free. Now, I wonder if you've ever stopped, if you're a working person, to weigh up your own work options like that. How is this step going to help me or hinder me in serving Jesus? In living a cross-shaped life of serving other people, not just serving myself. Maybe I would be better off if I was just satisfied to stay as I am. Paul says, you see, you're a slave? Don't worry about that. You can get free, okay, take it, but it's not your major ambition. Your major ambition is to be faithful in serving Jesus. And that's going to make us do all kinds of outlandish things. Like perhaps decline a promotion because you realise that putting all the extra time into your family is a more godly priority for you. Or because, as in the case of a mate of mine named Russell, he knew that the new shifts he'd be working would rule him out of leading his growth group on a Wednesday night. And to him, that was more important than all the promotions in the world. Might make you do strange things like step aside from a partnership opportunity and resign as a quantity surveyor at huge personal cost, like another friend of mine, when he realised that the numbers were being skewed corruptly by the company directors, by the other partners, and he just knew, as a servant of Jesus, he couldn't be part of that. At huge cost, he stepped aside. Strange decisions like giving up a career as a physiotherapist, like Andrew Poyser, who some of you might remember, to train as the pastor of a church, which he now is, or a career as an IT guy or a teacher or a doctor. Or give up a comfortable retirement like David and Heather Kelly and head for the Congo. Paul says to the slaves in Corinth, if you get offered your freedom, take it, but don't let it trouble you. Don't let it define you. Don't chase what everyone else is chasing, but be satisfied to be slaves of Christ. Over and over again, when Paul is saying remain as you are, he's really saying don't be troubled by your status or your worldly situation. Because compared to serving Jesus, who bought you and owns you already, those things are trivial. So I wonder where the rubber hits the road for you in that area. Okay, well, it's time to get to the M-rated stuff and look at cross-shaped contentment in the bedroom in marriage. Now, if you pull right back to the start of the chapter, you've got this delicately translated sentence that says, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. That's what they're suggesting, the Corinthians, in their letter. And it seems what they're talking about is sexual relations even inside marriage. It is good for a man, say some of the Corinthians in their letter to Paul, it's more spiritual if a man, even if he's married, abstains from sexual relations with his wife. Now, I'm sure it would be the Corinthian women saying that, not the Corinthian men. Commentaries suggest that they're part of a movement in the Corinthian church that's determined to be more spiritual than everyone else, however they can. And so if this is the line that the spiritual women are taking, maybe that's the reason. Back in chapter 6, we saw some of the men have to be warned against going to prostitutes, which is never the answer. Now, to us these days, I'm thinking this is kind of obvious, but maybe not. The questions Paul's addressing go like this. Paul, we think it's more spiritual to avoid sex altogether, even if you're married. Paul, in fact, we think it's more spiritual if you're not married to stay single. Paul, we think it's more spiritual if you've got an unbelieving partner to just divorce them, because otherwise they'll somehow make us impure. Paul, we think if a young man is engaged to his fiancée, it's more spiritual to just end it now. To all of which, Paul just wants to say no, 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 no and no. There might be some good reasons for those things, but they're certainly not the reasons you're thinking of. And he says, don't go laying down spiritual sounding rules about that stuff. Just be content to stay as you are. They are not the main thing. And so number one, he says, stop your crazy talk about husbands and wives not even touching each other. Look around, says Paul, at the sexual immorality that's happening. Figure it out for yourself. Now, it's interesting, I was watching a helicopter flying around dragging a big flag advertising Sexpo while I was preparing this talk Friday lunchtime. And it's kind of interesting that yesterday the Women's Christian Grow Conference was in one hall in at the convention centre, and Sexpo at the same time was in a hall down the corridor. And I guess the common perception would have been that it's the anti-sex group down one end, the Christians, and the pro-sex crowd down the other, which is only actually true if you're the Corinthian Christians. Because Paul says marriage is a great remedy for sexual immorality. Because that's where sex is meant for. It's a good thing, God made it. Now, there are maybe some couples in any crowd who need to hear what Paul's saying at this point, maybe for different reasons. Maybe unresolved arguments, or a power play. Maybe an angry wife using physical contact as a bargaining chip. Maybe a husband who makes himself so busy with other stuff that intimacy is just off the agenda, which just compounds problems that are already there even further. Paul says very clearly, do not withhold yourselves from one another. Because you see, marriage is such a great example of what he said, and we saw last week at the end of chapter 6. You are not your own. You've been bought at a price at the cross. It's not just about pleasing yourself. Nothing is about that, and marriage is not about that. It's about giving myself to you. Verse 3 and 4, here's the logic. It's not about abstaining, not about withholding from one another. The husband should fulfil his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. Because, says Paul, the wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. In the same way, the husband's body does not belong to him alone, but also his wife. And can you see that is perfectly reciprocal, perfectly balanced, perfectly non-sexist, he to her, her to him. If you're married, says Paul, you've actually given your body to the other, and so withholding is actually a kind of fraud, which is the strong word that Paul actually uses in verse 5 in the original, where he's literally saying if you are married, do not defraud one another this way. And he makes just one concession to the Corinthians who are wanting to sound so spiritual. Okay, he says, if you both agree about it, you can abstain for a time for prayer. Not tonight, dear, I'm praying. Well, Paul says, only if you both agree. And don't, in your efforts to be spiritual, end up giving Satan a foothold because of your lack of self-control. Now, that's his one concession, a fully agreed prayer break. Otherwise, on the matter of sex within marriage, he says, you Corinthians, you've got it totally wrong, in which they have been followed through the years, I suspect, by large sections of the Roman Catholic Church. Especially when it comes then to the question of celibacy, which Paul deals with in verses 7 and 8. But again, it is not about a command, it's not about laying down rules, it's just about contentment to stay as you are. I wish that all of you were as I am. I'm single, says Paul. But each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. Now, to the unmarried and the widows, I say it's good for them to remain unmarried as I do. But if they can't control themselves, they should marry, for it's better to marry than burn with passion. Paul says, I've got the gift of being single. Most of you haven't. Don't make me your role model on this. And if you want to marry and you've got the chance to marry, it's not wrong. It's just that it's not the main thing. But let's go a step further. What if you're married and you're not satisfied? What if you're married in Corinth and you're part of the church and you're thinking, this bloke that I've got is just a spiritual anchor, a lead weight. I need to cut the rope. Surely, Paul, that's okay. To which Paul says, no, no, no. I mean, he says this is just basic. The Lord Jesus himself said this. Marriage vows are meant to be permanent. So, verse 10, to the married I give this command, not I but the Lord. He said it. This is what Jesus says about divorce. A wife must not separate from her husband. But if she does, says Paul, then she's got to be content with that. She must stay unmarried, remain that way, or else be reconciled to her husband. And likewise, a husband must not divorce his wife. Be content to stay as you are. Now, we're not talking about the situation of marital unfaithfulness here, which is one ground for separation biblically, and we're not talking about abuse or violence here. God says back in Malachi chapter 2, he says, I hate divorce, but I really hate it when a man covers himself with violence. Paul's not talking about those issues. He's talking about splitting up a marriage because you're not satisfied with it, or you think it's somehow holding you back. But Paul, I've become a Christian and he's not. No, again. He says if you're worried that the non-Christian is somehow going to defile you, you spiritual sounding Corinthians, it's the opposite. Because the unbeliever is sanctified, which means set apart by being with you rather than the other way around. And who knows, he says, they might even end up being saved. Stay as you are. If the unbeliever leaves, verse 15, there's not much you can do about it. But other than that, stick with it. Remain. Stay as you are. Now, maybe that is a hard word in a world that's always looking for satisfaction and intimacy and happiness. And of course, marriage is the place in all the romance books and the Hollywood movies. Marriage is the place where you're meant to find that stuff. You'll say, surely I deserve to be happy. Paul says, remain. Aim for contentment instead. Living in peace, always with the hope in verse 16 that your unbelieving husband or wife might see something incredibly attractive about the fact that you're a person who follows the Lord Jesus. How do you know, wife, whether you'll save your husband, or husband, whether you will save your wife? Now, I know we want to bring all sorts of questions to a passage like this one, and for some of you it's talking about very live issues that are painful issues, about regrets that are always raw. Or maybe you need to think through very carefully what he's saying and be challenged. But the bottom line is, be content, and where possible, says Paul, stay the way you are, don't get itchy feet. Now, one more question from the Corinthians. What if I'm engaged? Everyone here in Corinth is telling me I should get out of it while I still can. Are these all spiritual, no-body, anti-sex Corinthian types? They're saying if you're betrothed and you become a Christian, call it off. If you're engaged, get out of it while you can. Even if it leaves your girl in the lurch. She's been waiting for you for years, the betrothals took years. Just leave it behind and say no. Which Paul answers in verses 36 to 38 and then the verses that follow. Do you call it off or don't you? And Paul says, well, there are some good reasons to call it off maybe, some good reasons not to. But in the end he says, I reckon it's best just to leave things the way they are. Do whichever you're most comfortable with. Here's the thing, verse 25. Now about virgins. That's what you asked about. Single betrothed girls. He says, well, Jesus didn't actually talk about this. I've got no direct teaching from Jesus like I did about divorce, but I'll give you a judgment anyway as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I'm his apostle. That's what I do. Because of the present crisis, he says, I think it is good for a man to remain as he is. Now, let me tell you, nobody knows what the present crisis was that he's talking about, what was going wrong. Some say it was the persecution that was coming from Rome as it spread around the empire. Bruce Winter says he reckons it's the huge famine that was sweeping through the area of Corinth. But whatever it is, it was a great reminder, you see, that this world is not everything. And the point is, again, against what the Corinthians are saying, Paul says just keep calm and carry on. It's good for a man to remain as he is, which means, you see, if you're pledged to be engaged to a woman, if you're engaged, then keep it that way. Follow it through, get married. If you're free from such a commitment, don't go looking for it. But either way, he says it's not a sin. If you marry, you haven't sinned, verse 28. If a virgin marries, she hasn't sinned. Although, and here's a verse that doesn't get preached on at many marriages, the second half of verse 28, But those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you from this. Graham McDougall laughed in a knowing way. See, in other words, though, in spite of what the Corinthians are saying, that they are making a big deal of it, Paul says, this question you're asking, this suggestion you're making that betrothed couples should break up, just let them sort it out for themselves. Keeping in mind this, that the time is short, verse 29, and that this world isn't everything. That we Christians should live in all the ways he lists there in verse 30 and 31, as if we are not engrossed with the world. And it is not ours to grasp and to keep. As if things like marriage and happiness and buying things, as if those are the things that real contentment is going to come from. Because they're not the things that make contentment. As if when you are single and you are longing to be married, that's going to make everything all right. It's not. As if you're married and you're unhappy and you think, if I can just get out of this marriage, things will be better. They won't. As if when you just buy this next new thing, that's going to make you satisfied. It's not. Because you know what's ultimately good for us? Most of us never quite get this. The thing that is good for us, says Paul, is contentment in wholeheartedly serving the Lord Jesus. Which is what he spells out from verse 32. It's not about being married or single. It's about being free from concern to serve the Lord Jesus wholeheartedly. Now, being single, you see, can free you from that, says Paul. And if you're not very careful, being married can stop you from that. But here's what he says, verse 32. I'd like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife. And his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. I'm saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord, which you see, according to Paul, is the only place where we're going to find real satisfaction and real contentment. Wholeheartedly serving the Lord Jesus. So the bottom line, keep at it. Stay as you are and seek to wholeheartedly serve the Lord Jesus. It might be tough, but be content and keep serving. Content in your workplace, slaving away because you love the Lord Jesus and you want to serve him. Content in your marriage, serving your wife, serving your husband, but more important than all of that, serving the Lord Jesus. Say to your restless heart, be still, and live that sort of cross-shaped life that says, I was bought at a price, so I no longer belong to me.